This woman was full of good works, which she had done. And it lists them in verse 37. But it came to pass in those days that she was sick and died. But this woman is remarkable for what she's been doing. But now, in verse 37, she's not only sick, she died. Now, again, she's living with believers and known as a disciple, and she's sick and she dies. And they prepared her as they would do, but instead of burying her, for reasons which they don't explain, they laid her in like a bedroom. That's what I'm assuming, an upper chamber. It's a bedroom. And because Lydda was near Joppa and Peter was still at Lydda, the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydda, and they sent 2 men asking him that he would come quickly. So by verse 39, Peter got up, went with them. When he was come, they brought him into the upper room, and all the widows stood by him and by this dead Dorcas, showing the coats and garments which Dorcas had made while she was with them. So, in fact, she goes down in history. I mean, this is quite a remarkable story because of this particular woman, the work that she was doing. And you can see that it's not only preaching, it's not only witnessing, but sometimes it's the practical help that she was giving. I mean, even today we find that even as an evangelist, I find part of my ministry is giving practical help where it's needed. And we have fed the hungry, and we have provided clothes, we have sent medical equipment down through the years, and at the moment, certainly in the Ukraine, we're working to send even necessary equipment to the front line. So you can understand this is all part of the ministry. But what happens? Verse 39. So he's gone into the bedroom where this dead disciple is, Dorcas. And in verse 40, what does Peter do? He turned them all out. I'm reminded Jesus had to do this once, that because of the weeping and the wailing, when that girl was dead, the 12-year-old girl, he turned all these unbelieving believers out. And then what Jesus did, took her by the hand, and she rose up and Peter's doing exactly the same thing. He kneeled down and he prayed. And if you compare this with the previous miracle, where without being asked, Peter's gone into Aeneas' house and simply said, "Get up, Jesus Christ is healing you." Now, in verse 40, Peter puts everybody out and then kneels down and prays. And it says very clearly, he turned to the dead woman and said to her, using the name Tabitha, he says, "Tabitha, arise." And the dead woman opened her eyes and saw Peter, must have recognized who he was, and in shock, she sits up. I love this bit because Peter prays, and when he prays, he simply says to Tabitha, "Get up." In the authorized this as arise, it means simply get up in plain English. And she responded by opening her eyes. And when she saw Peter, she sat up. And in verse 41, he gave her his hand, lifted her up, and when he'd called the saints and widows, presented her alive. You know, to me, this is such a tremendous challenge, because Peter was having to do this. In both these cases, it was completely different. It's not as if there was a formula, not as if there was a set way of doing it, because when he's with Aeneas, who's been sick for 8 years, then he just simply speaks and raises the challenge, and the sick man is healed. But now it's a case where Tabitha has died, and they're weeping over her because she was a known and loved disciple, and Peter acts differently. He puts all the people, because they're all weeping and making a noise. It was a tradition that if someone died, you actually paid. I don't know whether you realise this, but you actually paid for people to come in and do the crying. I find it's an amazing story, but it's actually true. You didn't just have the relatives, but you sort of had people coming in to cry for you. I find it very unusual. But so the result was, yes, the people that were there and crying and watching over Dorcas or Tabitha, they were very concerned. They missed her, they lost her. She was a woman that they were depending on, who'd done a lot of work while she was there. But Peter's reaction is so different here in that he didn't want that, because he could see that the people that were crying and weeping were not full of faith that a miracle was happening. They'd called him down, but they weren't expecting a miracle. I don't know why. I mean, they sent 2 men, because in the previous case, it wasn't raising the dead, it was just healing the sick. With Aeneas, it wasn't that. He was, so he'd been bedridden for 8 years, and it was a big miracle. But this time, they've called for him after Dorcas is dead. I mean, that's what it says. It says, she died, verse 37, she died. And in verse 38, because they'd heard that Peter was not very far away, they sent 2 men asking him to come quickly. So can you see the contrast in the first case? He's praying over a man bedridden for 8 years, and they couldn't do anything, the disciples. Now they've come to Dorcas, and they've accepted the fact she's dead, and so they paid these people to come in and weep over her. And now Peter takes a different attitude, turns them all out, kneels down and prays. And it doesn't say what he prayed. You would think here at this point you would get some inclination of how he prayed. None. So he prayed alone and prayed privately. And then, having prayed, turned to the dead woman and simply says, Tabitha, get up. And immediately she responded by opening her eyes. Notice, firstly she opens her eyes, the dead woman, and when she saw it was Peter, she sat up. And in verse 41, yes, he took her hand and helped her to get up. And then he called the saints and the widows, saying, she's alive.